When I was in seminary, I had a couple of friends my first year, and consistently, about once a week, around 9:30 or 10 p.m., they would come by my room as I was trying to do homework, and they would insist that I go with them to go to Krispy Kreme. And they wouldn't leave me alone, and so I'd be dragged away from my homework, and 10 p.m. at night, we'd be driving across Washington, D.C. to buy Krispy Kreme donuts. We'd come back and distribute them to the guys on our floor, which gives you a different image of seminary than maybe you expect. But it was always a joy, but I always was reluctant to be pulled away. But there was this kind of call from my friends, dragging me away from what I was doing. And I share that story because of an interesting theme I've noticed the last few weeks in our Lenten readings. We heard last week how Jesus was led into the desert by the Spirit. He led by the Spirit into the desert. And in both our first reading and our gospel today, we hear of God's initiative bringing people closer to him, bringing them away to be with him. In the first reading, Abram is taken out of his home, drawn by God to go on this journey. In our gospel, it says that Jesus led Peter, James, and John up the mountain by themselves. So there's this consistent theme of the Lord drawing people away from their own plans and own projects to come be with him. And it can kind of blow up their schedules and plans, just like my own time at the seminary, but there's something beautiful and something very good about that. And that's really what our readings are about today, are about this communion with God, especially in the essence of prayer with God. Whenever someone goes up a mountain in Scripture, it's a symbol of being close to God. It's a time of prayer. And in Luke's account of the Transfiguration, it says Jesus went up the mountain to pray. And if you look at the Gospels, you notice that Jesus prays all the time. He's constantly at prayer in the Gospels. And we might wonder why he does that, because he's got a lot of other important things to do. And so why does Jesus make so much time for prayer? It's especially interesting that Jesus often prays before really important moments. He prays before choosing the apostles to follow him. He prays before going to Jerusalem, and he prays before entering into the Passion. And since we're in Lent, we're thinking about prayer. It's one of the 3 pillars of Lent: prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. And so it's worth us reflecting on this pillar of prayer and recognizing a way that God is doing something similar to us that he does with Abram and with Jesus, and that my friends did with me in seminary. That is, he's calling us away to be closer to him. And during Lent, it means a kind of sacrifice of even setting aside maybe our other plans to be with the Lord. It's especially beautiful to recognize that prayer is not something that we ourselves are initiating, as if it's you and I just reaching out to God and him waiting passively for us. No, our readings keep insisting that God is himself taking the initiative and drawing us closer to him. And so it's worth reflecting a little bit on the dynamics of prayer, how we approach prayer, and what can maybe help us to enter into prayer better. Because a thing I've noticed is sometimes I'm eager to pray. Sometimes I have this experience of kind of an excitement about prayer. And maybe you know this experience too. Maybe on a retreat or after a grace-filled moment, you kind of have a desire to pray. You're like, oh, I want to spend time with God. I want to sit and pray. And yet at other times I find that I don't feel like praying. And maybe you know this feeling as well, that prayer feels unappealing, like an obligation, a burden. It's the last thing we want to do, and the temptation is to put it off until when we feel like it more. Sometimes that's the sound of God's call, drawing us in, and we don't want to follow it. For Lent, I've been trying to make more time for prayer, and I haven't been doing very well at it so far. And so if you've had a rough start with whatever your Lenten practice is, know that you're not alone, and we're in solidarity. But one of the big challenges for prayer is simply that starting point of even creating the opportunity. And it's because, like Jesus, you and I also have many important things to do, many things on our schedules and radars, and it can be hard to carve out that space. But I want to suggest that being a Christian, being a follower of Jesus, is actually not first and foremost about what we do. And this can be a common misconception, that we think being a Christian is primarily, about being kind and generous and loving and forgiving and serving others. And those are all good and necessary things, no doubt about it. But they're not the first thing. They're not the most important thing. Again, if we look at Jesus, what does Jesus do first? What does he always do first? He prays. Jesus always prays. And so this might be a countercultural idea, but I'd like to suggest, and I think our reading suggests it as well, that the most important thing that Christians do is to pray. The most important thing we do is to carve out this time and space to be with God, to listen to God, to speak to God. There's a story of Mother Teresa. We have a window of her in the church here, and Mother Teresa had her missionaries of charity, and one of the sisters at one point said that, there's so many needs to be addressed, so many people to be served that, they could do more if they didn't spend a whole hour in prayer every day in adoration. And Mother Teresa's response was to add a second hour of prayer each day. Now, of course, no one's going to accuse Mother Teresa of not caring for those in need, of all people. So what was she doing? Why did she make this move? Mother Teresa recognized that first and foremost, it's not our own plans, our own efforts that make a difference, but the will of God and the work of God. And so we have to first be in tune with the Lord, to follow his plans and discover that he's often way ahead of us. And if we cooperate with his will, that things actually come together very smoothly. That's what our second reading was talking about. Paul to Timothy says, God called us to a holy life, not according to our works, but according to his own design. The Lord knows what he's doing, and Mother Teresa knew this above all, God's providence often at work in her life and in her ministry. The Lord knows what he's about, and he's often steps ahead of us. And so it's essential that we dedicate ourselves to prayer, that we put ourselves in that place to be available to God, that when we feel that tug, when we hear that call, that we have the grace and the effort to at least try to say, Lord, I'm going to try to pray. I don't know how to pray well, but let me respond in some way and trust that he can make good even a small and insignificant effort. Of course, we got to think about practically what does it look like to pray? How do we pray? And again, Jesus can give us a couple of examples. If we look at Jesus, he sacrifices time and he always steps away in some way to create this space. So it requires saying no to something else, or at least saying not yet. Jesus takes time away to begin with prayer. And then he often will move to a place where he can be with the Lord and focus on him. Sometimes Jesus gets up extra early before dawn. Sometimes he steps away from the crowds. Sometimes he stays awake in the garden, even when his disciples are tired. So Jesus dedicates time and space, and it's very practical in that way. But of course, then what do we do when we find ourselves in that time and space? Maybe you're at adoration on a Tuesday or a Thursday night. You're sitting there, what do I do now? Where do I begin? Well, what does God the Father tell us in our gospel today? He says, listen. It's his instruction to the apostles. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. I'd like to suggest that prayer is not rocket science. It might be helpful to think of it more like a friendship. It consists of spending time together, talking, listening, asking questions. There's a sort of unstructured element to prayer that we dedicate this time to the Lord, and then we listen to how he speaks to our minds, how he speaks to our hearts. He can speak through the scriptures that we look at. He can speak through sacred images, beautiful images like our windows or some of the different icons or even the stations of the cross that we have in the church. The Lord can speak to us in many ways, and so we try to listen. And listening can be hard, but it's worth the effort. Our gospel today is really like an allegory for prayer, all things considered. The disciples go to pray. They spend time with Jesus. They look at Jesus. They talk with him. They ask him questions. They're confused. They don't know exactly what to say or how to understand, but they listen. And their eyes are opened. They see who Jesus truly is. They recognize God, they encounter God, and they see God. And that's really what happens through prayer. And so as we continue with this Lenten season, I invite you to be courageous in seeking to make time for prayer. And I'll share with you one last discovery that I've made over the years that, and maybe I've said this before, but looking back, I realize I never regret the time that I spend in prayer. And I'll often look back at my day, maybe you do too, and say, I wasted a lot of time here, or I didn't really ever get to that over there. But I never regret time spent praying with the Lord. And it's always worthwhile, even if I don't have anything tangible to show for it. I'll leave you with some words from Joseph Ratzinger, his book, Behold the Pierced One. He says, the central act of Jesus was prayer. Unbroken communication with the one he called Father. It is only possible really to understand Jesus by entering into this act of prayer, by participating in it. The person who prays begins to see.